The Egyptian symbol of dusk and dawn looks like two small animals with their backs attached to each other and a solar bird over their heads. This symbol can be seen next to the figure of Venus in the primary horoscopes of both Dendera zodiacs. Once again, one has to note with regret the changes introduced into the long zodiac of Dendera after restoration. The female figure with a planetary rod behind Aries, which represented Venus in the primary horoscope, has now been replaced by a male figure with a planetary rod. As a result, not a single female figure with a planetary rod remains on the zodiac that could serve as a symbol of Venus in the primary horoscope. In both Dendera zodiacs we see the decapitation scene next to the constellation of Aquarius. A man with a knife in his hand has grabbed some animal by the ears and demonstrates the intention to decapitate it. On the round Dendera zodiac, a similar animal is depicted nearby, but with its head already cut off. In the long zodiac the decapitated figure is human. It is most likely that the scene depicts the decapitation of John the Baptist, symbolized by Aquarius. Earlier, in the context of winter solstice symbolism, we have already mentioned the scene where the man with a falcon's head is stabbing a calf, which has only got one leg, to death with a spear. It is possible that the scene in question is not purely astronomical, and that the symbol is closer to religion and astrology, similarly to the decapitation scene as described earlier. It is possible that some scene from the Holy Writ has been represented in astral or celestial symbols. It is hard to decipher their exact meaning. It can be simply pointed out that the feast of stabbing a calf or a bull to death was already well known in the Middle Ages, and hails from a Christian country, Spain, where it exists to this very day, the famous bullfighting. It is possible that the Spanish bullfighting is another memory of the same event as depicted in the Egyptian zodiacs as the scene with the one-legged calf stabbed to death. The event in question might be in some relation to Jesus Christ, since the ancient artwork that depicts the god Mithras stabbing a bull to death is most likely to be referring to Christ. Fomenko and Nosovsky have calculated all legitimate decipherments of every zodiac's primary horoscope in their research. Versions considered legitimate included variants that also took into account the most reliable and unambiguous conjectures of the previous researchers of Egyptian zodiacs. The greatest advances in this direction were made in the works of Morozov. Let us list the zodiac decipherment conditions. First condition. The astronomical meaning of any figure or symbol in the zodiac shouldn't contradict the meaning of similar figures or symbols in other Egyptian zodiacs. In other words, the research was based on the assumption that all ancient Egyptian zodiacs shared a single system of symbols. Therefore, if we encounter one symbol or another in several different zodiacs, we are safe to assume that it means the same thing in every case, or at least that such meanings do not contradict each other. Of course, this doesn't mean it's true for every Egyptian zodiac without exception. However, should this fail to be the case, the authors wouldn't have been able to find ideal astronomical solutions for each and every zodiac, acting on this assumption. Indeed, the amount of astronomical information found in zodiacs can be great enough. Therefore, the possibility that there might be random ideal astronomical solutions of all Egyptian zodiacs based on an erroneous decipherment is right out of the question. However, since Fomenko and Nosovsky have indeed found ideal solutions for every zodiac, the principle of uniform approach to the decipherment of all Egyptian zodiacs is justified. Second condition. If an inscription of some sort is found next to a planetary figure in a zodiac, it must be taken into account in the decipherment. This was, obviously enough, only taken into account in cases where translations of such inscriptions were available. One must admit that said translations are more often than not ambiguous and vague, which makes it impossible to obtain any decisive astronomical indications from these inscriptions. Nevertheless, they are of some help in decipherment. Some such inscriptions were translated by Heinrich Brugsch, a famous Egyptologist of the 19th century. The authors have also been using Brugsch's translations for reference in their research. Third condition. Venus, being a female planet, has to be symbolized by a female figure, not male. Morozov was the first to point this out, correcting the mistake of Brugsch, who identified a male planetary figure from the round zodiac as Venus. In some of the zodiacs, a single planet is symbolized by a whole procession of wayfarers and not just a single figure. In this case, the procession of Venus must contain a single female figure at the very least. Vice versa, neither Saturn, Jupiter or Mercury were ever depicted as female figures. Those planets were believed to be strictly male in their symbolism. The Sun was also considered a male planet in European and Egyptian astral symbolism. However, in case of the Sun, the authors have made no ban on female figures in zodiac decipherment. This is of little importance at any rate, since the Sun in the primary horoscope was usually drawn as a circle and not a human figure, thus rendering the gender issue irrelevant. However, the Sun is often drawn as a human figure in secondary horoscopes. The research has revealed that the figures in question are always male. As for Mars, the figure itself is male, according to mythology, but may be accompanied by female figures. In Roman mythology, for instance, Mars was often accompanied by the female image of Mars's valor. In Greek mythology, where Mars was known as Ares, his companions were Eris, the goddess of discord, and the bloodthirsty Enyo. In other words, Mars had female companions. Also, Greek mythology employs the female figure of Athena as a double of Mars, in a certain sense. Therefore, the authors considered couples and processions consisting of figures of either gender acceptable for Mars, and even solitary female planetary figures, as long as this didn't interfere with the identification of Venus. However, the study of finite solutions revealed that Mars was always portrayed as a male figure in Egyptian zodiacs. Fourth condition. A two-faced male figure holding a planetary rod stands for the planet Mercury in every Egyptian zodiac. The two-faced wayfarer doesn't necessarily appear in an Egyptian zodiac. Mercury could be portrayed differently. However, no other planet than Mercury has ever been portrayed as a two-faced wayfarer. Fifth condition. If we see a male wayfarer with a crescent or crescent-shaped horns on his head, the planet in question is Saturn. On the round zodiac of Dendera, the planetary figure with a crescent on its head was also carrying a scythe in one of the cases, a well-known attribute of Saturn. This is how Saturn was portrayed in the ancient astral symbolism. Sixth condition. The sign of circle stands for either the sun or the moon in Egyptian zodiacs. The fact that a circle contains a crescent doesn't necessarily identify it as the moon. Such circles can just as easily symbolize the sun, possibly, in order to emphasize that a new moon is always born in the vicinity of the sun. Also, a circle without a crescent doesn't necessarily stand for the sun. It can also refer to a full moon, which is observed as a disk and not a crescent. However, an independent crescent that isn't part of a circle must by all means represent the moon. Due to such similarity between solar and lunar symbols in Egyptian zodiacs, the issue of which circle stood for which celestial object was usually solved by simple computer calculations involving all possible variants. All identification options of circles, solar and lunar, were considered equally possible. Let us conclude with a list of certain specific traits of Egyptian planetary symbolism in zodiacs, which haven't been known previously. They weren't accounted for in decipherment. Such traits manifested in the course of astronomical calculations and comparison of resulting solutions. Falcon's head, Mars. If the zodiac in question contains a planetary figure with the head of a falcon and without any other distinctive characteristics, it can be identified as Mars. In general, Mars was drawn with a falcon's head more often than any other planet in Egyptian zodiacs. The head of an ibis, Saturn or Mercury. A planetary figure with the head of an ibis identifies as Saturn or Mercury in Egyptian zodiacs. Jackal's head, Saturn or Mercury. Jackal's head might also identify a planetary figure as Saturn or Mercury. Bull or a bull's head, Saturn. The bull-shaped sign or hieroglyph stands for planet Saturn. In some of the Egyptian zodiacs, those from Dendera for example, Saturn has apparently got the head of a bull. Goose, Mars. The goose is a symbol of Mars in Egyptian zodiacs. It was usually depicted next to the head of a planetary figure or under its feet. In the latter case, the goose stood for Mars in a secondary horoscope, simultaneously acting as a transposition sign. Lioness, Venus. The lioness is a symbol of Venus in Egyptian zodiacs. Crocodile, Venus, in a number of cases. In some of the zodiacs, the sign of the crocodile appears to symbolize Venus. The visibility of planets may depend on the observer's position in certain cases. The visibility of certain planets is indicated in Egyptian zodiacs, and therefore has to be verified in the analysis of astronomical solutions. Fomenko and Nosovsky have used Cairo in Egypt as the assumed observer's position in their calculations. Moreover, in ambiguous cases they have also checked planetary visibility for the Egyptian city of Luxor on the Nile, some 500 kilometers further south than Cairo. Luxor was chosen as the possible observer's location due to the fact that the temples of Dendera and Esna, where the large ceiling zodiacs were found, are located in its immediate vicinity. Moreover, the royal necropolis is very close to Luxor on the Nile. The ceilings of some tombs were also decorated with zodiacs. Since an Egyptian zodiac was the astronomical description of a whole year that the zodiacal date falls on, it was important to find out what date the ancient Egyptians used to mark the beginning of a year. Nowadays, years are counted off January, but this hasn't always been the case. In the Middle Ages, for example, New Year could come in March or September. When did the Egyptian year begin? Let us consider the actual Egyptian zodiacs first of all. Apparently, there are no explicit indications of this sort anywhere. It might be that the Egyptian New Year symbolism remains beyond decipherment to date. Nevertheless, the beginning of a year as observed by the authors of a given zodiac can be calculated reliably enough. Judging by the order of constellations, the new year started in the constellations of Leo and Virgo, the month of September. Indeed, let us consider the rectangular zodiacs: the long zodiac of Dendera, the lesser zodiac of Esna and the greater zodiac of Esna. In the lesser zodiac of Esna, the entire zodiacal row is stretched into a single procession of constellations and planets. It is therefore easy enough to find the zodiacal constellation that opened the year. It must lead the procession. Unfortunately, the part that must depict the beginning of the procession is missing. But even the remaining part suffices to conclude that the leader of the procession is the constellation of Virgo, which means that the Egyptian year began in September. The situation with the long zodiac of Dendera and the greater zodiac of Esna is somewhat more complex, but it is possible to make a conclusion nonetheless. In each case, the zodiacal procession is divided into two parts. Therefore, there can be two candidates for leadership among the constellations depicted on these zodiacs. In the long zodiac of Dendera, it's either Leo or Aquarius. There are close ties between the symbols of Leo and Virgo in this zodiac, which is the case with many other Egyptian zodiacs as well. Therefore, strictly speaking, we should name the Leo-Virgo couple as the first constellation here. In the greater zodiac of Esna, the constellation that leads the procession is either Virgo-Leo or Pisces. A final comparison of all cases tells us that the first constellation in the annual procession of constellations and planets in Egyptian zodiacs must have been Virgo. In other words, the Egyptian year began in September. No other Egyptian zodiacs contradict this conclusion. The conclusion made on the basis of purely formal analysis of the Egyptian zodiacs is in perfect correspondence with the known peculiarities of Egyptian climate. According to Morozov, the September beginning of the year must have truly been an Egyptian tradition, since it is defined by the annual floods on the Nile. Morozov has put forth the proposition that the custom of beginning the year in September, which the Russian Orthodox Church managed to preserve for so many years, came to the Orthodox East and Russia in particular, from Egypt. The Russian Orthodox calendars in Church Slavonic indicate the September 1st, by the Julian calendar, as follows: beginning of the indiction, or the New Year. Before the reforms of Peter the Great, Russians celebrated New Year in September. Therefore, Egyptian year began in autumn, September to be more precise. The day of autumn equinox in September fell over the new year already, since the symbols of autumn equinox are at the head of the annual procession. Consequently, the annual order of equinoxes and solstices as implied by the Egyptian zodiacs was as follows: autumn equinox in September, beginning of the year. Winter solstice in December, same year. Spring equinox in March, same year. Summer solstice in June, end of the year. The authors have referred to this very sequence of solstice and equinox points in their analysis of the year's secondary horoscopes, assuming the year to begin in September. All the astronomical solutions that they have discovered satisfy to the secondary horoscopes under the assumption that the Egyptian year began in September. Nevertheless, Fomenko and Nosovsky didn't consider September to be the mandatory beginning of a year. In order to make the solutions more reliable, they have checked concurrence with secondary horoscopes for all possible beginnings of a year. However, in final solutions the year turned out to begin in September, insofar as the zodiac in question permitted to calculate it in the first place.